Hi, everybody. Thank you and welcome to our panel. We appreciate you being here. Echo in this room. We put this panel together because both Richard and I noticed a dearth of conversation taking place within anthropology regarding the use and organization of digital data, particularly in my home department, sharing files with colleagues and students, asking them about how they organize their digital selves and how they plan to keep their research data organized. I was met with blank stares. So what's interesting here is that this idea of what data are and getting our head around understanding that they're not just numbers, but they're measurements, they're observations, descriptions, all of these things that we collect as researchers. And then the differences between what it means to be digitally born and analog. So going back through our old data, the notes that we hand wrote, the photos that we have on film, that sort of thing, the maps that we actually made, the databases we created, these things can become digital and they can be organized and they can be used in research and they can be shared and given to other folks to work with. So this kind of started a whole conversation with our colleagues. You know, how do we do this? How do we start, where do we even begin? And so many people didn't have answers for those things. And so we decided that we would put a call together and ask people to help us think through these things. Little did we know that this conversation was taking place already in different corners of the AAA and different corners of social science. So Richard is trained as an anthropologist and now is working as a librarian, and he witnessed similar faculty and student issues. From planning projects to following through and archiving the data, we have to have a plan for how we're going to organize and share and store our work. This panel represents our attempt at sharing the breadth of the problems and the solutions our colleagues have been engaged with at many levels. So one of my questions is, why is this so difficult for social scientists to really grapple with, and why does it take place in so many different ways? We're going to address organization, ethics of data, the federal requirements, responses by other social scientists, and new uses for the data that are coming out. So in terms of organization, it's not necessary to calculate the amount of research we find ourselves swimming in today. It's everywhere, being offered, absorbed, ignored, and taken. We continue to struggle with how to organize and store it all, so when we need them, we can find them. When I ask about file naming conventions or basic rules people follow in organizing their data, the only people with acceptable answers were the librarians, namely the digital archivist at my university. Her conventions didn't meet my needs, but they did set me thinking about what file names should look like, how I should organize my data, how I should archive 20 years of work. So I could find it, I could share it, and others could use it. So by right-clicking on files, icons on my desktop, I could then access the fields for the metadata, the codes that describe the file, searchable words that help me find things when I need them, beyond the simple file name. There are more sophisticated schemes you can use to help you populate your metadata so your work is findable by others. And this is when I started learning about the Dublin Core, the work that Ahrefs puts together. And the DPAs, the more I started working with trying to find funding sources for my work, the more I was required to talk about data management plans. And so, and all these things are addressed in the conversations that are taking place, digital preservation and archiving. And of course, this brings up the idea of ethics and like the work that we do. What's ethical? How do we deal with the data? Who can we share the data with? What are the risks of the data? Who controls them? Who has access? And how do we make them available to others? And how do we maintain human subject concerns? So, so there are federal requirements for these things. If you go for federal grants, like I said, the data management plans, which I want Richard to talk about, so I'm going to just motor on through these things. NSF, NEH, NIH, they all require data management plans. When you talk to your faculty about this, I'm again met with blank stares. Where do I go? What do I do? How do I do this? How do I collaborate? How do I share my data with other people, which is what these requirements are all about, preservation and sharing. So there are a number of resources that I found as I started digging into this that anthropologists have taken a role in. And there's this thing that I really appreciated was the 2009 Anthro DPA report, which was generated by the NSF and Wintergren-sponsored work. I'm not going to click on my live link there, but it's there. You can find it. And then later, more recently, the 2015 Research Data Alliance, this white paper called Practical Policies Recommendations for Data Management that was kind of spearheaded by Mike and Kim Fortune, which is really quite interesting, especially for ethnography. And then most recently, the AAA has put up the Digital Data Management Resources page on their website, and this is something else for anthropologists to use. So now I'm going to ask Richard Freeman to come forward and talk about his work.
Me? Hello. So you don't have to read all this text, but this is just text that I got straight from the NSF website. And as you can see, it tells you that the National Science Foundation has a new requirement, and that is a management of data generated using NSF support. And this goes more and more with every grant you're going to be asked to get. So you should have a short plan and answer questions like, what data are generated by your research, and what is your plan for managing the data? Also, further into the NSF website, they talk about sharing the policy, and that you're supposed to share the data now that it's collected and gathered. And since you have public funding, you should make your data and results as public as possible. And so these are some more text telling you what you have to do, what types of data, samples, physical collections, the standards you're going to use for data and the metadata so that you could recognize it and retrieve it when you need to and share it. Policies for access and sharing, for open access, and for reuse and distribution. So all these you're expected to know what to do. And the more I've spoken with social scientists, the more I realize that they don't really have a clue what a data management plan looks like. They're supposed to promptly prepare to submit for publication, as well as get your other data out there as quickly as possible and as expediently and cost effectively as possible. Now I want to leave you here with a couple things that are just very practical that you could do on your own. And there's a data management planning tool, and you could find it at dmptool.org, and it's a freeware, and it's created by the University of California Systems. So for those of you who are going to be writing grants and you don't know even how to start making a data management plan, this is a good place to start. This is a screenshot of what it looks like there. You do have to be affiliated with the university, and you have to create an account within the tool, but there's a drop-down list, and you'll see that most of your colleges and universities have the rights to create this form. And you could see here, if it's clear, that in the darker print, it says your data types. Let's see, it's too dark for me to read that. Data types, format standards, capture methods, ethics and intellectual property, access data sharing and reuse, short-term storage and data management, deposit and long-term preservation, and resourcing. So these are all things that your grants, the people who are going to award you a grant, want to know that you know what you're doing with all the data you're collecting. They also, on the DMP tool website, have lists of all sorts of different granting agencies, so you could find, hopefully you could find the one that you're applying to, and they'll give you a template for that grant. I'm going to see if I could call this up.
I think we have to get online. We're not online.
Oh, we're not online?
Yeah, we need to get online.
So these aren't going to do anything?
Okay, get online. sorry.
Do we have any performers in the audience?
It's not,
Okay, well.
Here.
Oh,
Here.
yeah, but does it need a password?
Yeah, I have to go on it. No,
You're connected to the internet.
yeah, cool. So you should be.
So put it back up there. All right, I'll try it.
Sorry.
All that just to show you what the homepage looks like, although I had copies of all the pages inside. It tells you all sorts of things you need to do. If I go to log in. See, it says select your institution, and there's a whole list of institutions then.
It's not showing.
It's not?
Yeah.
What do I have to do? Help.
We need to, how do you drag it over?
Drag what over? All right, let's just forget about it. How do I drag?
Do you drag the screen over to the other, to,
I don't know what that means.
you said drag it to the right.
Okay, well, this is. I have to close all this. I have to get to,
You just take that and take it to the right.
but I have to go to the desktop, don't I? What do you mean to the right?
Just drag the whole, yeah, there you go, there you go.
To the
Just
right?
keep dragging. There it
Ah.
goes. See?
Okay, but now I can't see it. Oh, there we go. But I can't see it.
Can you see it down there?
Yeah, but okay. I can't see, no. So I can't see the cursor. All right, we're just going to move along here, if I can get back. No. Now what? This height? Yeah.
No,
What's-
we were used in presenter mode, so in presenter
Yeah.
mode, you have to have them in separate, that's the problem.
It's bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he doesn't
I was
see.
here yesterday, we had
Okay.
problems, so I might be able to help.
Okay.
That's great.
Well, if I could get back to where I was, I'll finish this and we'll move on.
Here, right there.
Yeah, what do I have to do? Move it?
I just double click it.
Oh, I did, and that's,
It's down there.
yeah, well, this doesn't help me any. You can't use the cursor down there.
Can we drive? Let me see.
What's the guy in the back do?
What are you trying to do? Well, he's trying to bring,
Well, now trying to go back to the,
he's trying to keep,
Try hit
well, did-
F5 is the,
but he's trying to
I'm
run
trying to
that,
well,
so he can't see
I
the
can't see
cursor
what I'm
down there.
doing, and now I'm just trying to get back because we're out of time.
So that's,
But now it's not showing up there.
so how do you?
How do I go back?
I kind of suggested that we do duplicate.
Okay, she's saying that you can't see well anyway down there.
Okay. Well, all right, well, I'll just finish up. The last thing I was going to show you, I really did need to use the internet. A way to disseminate some of your data in the raw file to share it with the research world and the academic world. University of Florida has a multi-national digital archive called the Digital Library of the Caribbean. And under that, there's a lot of sub-collections, and we work with the institutions in a lot of the Caribbean islands and a couple main ones in Europe and in the US. And I've been working with a linguist who's studying Haitian Creole. So on an NEH grant, we've gone down to Haiti and Little Haiti in Miami to document Vodou ceremonies, religious ceremonies. So I've done video work, I've done interviews, we've taken photographs of the ceremonies, et cetera, and we've put it up in an archive created called the Vodou Archive. And now it is raw data, and Professor Hebblethwaite, Ben, is doing further research on it. It's not the final products for the grants, but it's a way of getting your data out there for other people who are also interested in maybe comparative religious studies, or also interested in Haitian religions, or to use as teaching, to help with teaching courses, that it's all available there in the public, and that is part of the definition of what public access to your raw data is. And with that, we will now hear from 4 very creative anthropologists who are using the new abilities to share and to generate data in the new ways in the digital world. And they'll tell us about their experiences in handling and using and even studying how data is made and what data management plans look like. One is from a Mellon Foundation funded study on how faculty from across the academic landscape integrate digital technologies throughout their research, to sharing raw data sets, issues of balancing granting agencies' requirements for data sharing with the concern of promised protection for their subjects, which is obviously very big for anthropological studies, not maybe so much for history and the humanities. Digitizing and making public field records of archaeological investigations. And our first presenter is Dr. Janneke Verhegen from, I'm sure I mispronounced that, from Leiden University in the Netherlands, and she will discuss how and why she chose to use hyperlinks in her ethnography to allow her readers to jump directly to her field notes on the subject that was being discussed in the ethnography.
All right, good afternoon. I want to tell you about the access that I have provided to my raw anthropological field notes. To be more precise, I want to tell you what I did exactly. I want to tell you why I wanted to do it, and the ethical dilemmas that I struggled with because I wanted to do this. I want to show you how I did it. I didn't just throw it all out on the table, but I tried to do it in such a way that it actually added to the analysis. And this what and why and how all and intertwined very much. And throughout this process of intertwinement emerged a certain format of data sharing. So lastly, I'd like to reflect on how this particular format will in turn shape our thinking about the raw research materials. Now, I didn't provide this open access because there was some external funding agency that demanded it from me. Neither, in fact, because I had this prior noble ideals about sharing. It was because of the research of this particular research, it was through this process of data production and data analysis that I came to want to share to open up the data, the raw field notes, the research material. So I'll have to start briefly with giving you some background information to the particular research. So I lived in a village in the south of Malawi for 1 year, together with a research assistant, a young Malawian woman with a secondary school degree but no social science background. And the both of us, we kept daily notes of whatever we observed or overheard or chatted about, whatever we could lay our hands on, so to say. And our field notes are very different, obviously. What we felt was noteworthy, how we reflected on it, the kind of evidence that we assembled to come to certain conclusions. So hers, to me, has this very interesting extra layer of information. We started off doing interviews, but very soon found that it was very difficult to produce reasonably reliable accounts through this format of direct, straightforward questioning. Asking straightforward questions about more or less anything was considered inappropriate, not only by us, but by everybody within the community. It was unusual, it was uncomfortable. So to go very short, it was very difficult to get to the information that I wanted to get to. But in other ways, the research was very challenging too. For example, physically, mentally, for myself, living in such an extremely poor village meant that I too was faced with hunger, with the side effects of malarial drugs, for example, because I didn't have good food to minimize the side effects. I thought it was very difficult that I had absolutely no contact with my own world. There was no phone connection, phone signal. We could go to the nearest town, which was like a 2-hour bike drive, but there was no internet there, so I could try to send a text message, and I got desperate every now and then. And I mentioned this because these are all factors that led me to make this decision of sharing the data. So it was taxing, but it was definitely worthwhile to spend all this time and to make all these sacrifices and to suffer and to just endure, because eventually we found a modus operandi. And we found a way of coexisting that for all of us was reasonably comfortable, and that we had this more natural way of interacting. The woman in the midst is my research assistant, and she could knit very well, and I wanted to learn how to knit. So she was teaching me at the end of every day in the shade of her house, which soon led to many women from the village gathering every afternoon and chatting about what they felt was interesting to be talking about, and gossiping and making jokes, and that's all very, very rich information. And I had lived in Malawi before. I had lived in the capital for 3 years prior to doing this research, and I worked for an organization trying to combat or improve the food security of these kind of farmers. And I spent my 3 years in the office, reading report after report, going to conferences, going to meetings, every now and then going on a field visit, like a brief in and out, pre-organized trip. And there was just no way, not in a million years of doing that I could have ever gained the insights into what it actually is to be living in such a village, what village life really entails, if I hadn't actually endured this and taken time gained the insights through this really classical anthropological approach. Neither through interviews would I ever have gotten to the insights that I gained. But you can imagine if two people, so me and my research assistant, both kept daily track of whatever people were telling us. We were overhearing at the water pump, for example, that I ended up by the end of the year with this massive pile of chaotic field notes. If you have structured interviews, at least in the end you have some kind of structure to your research material, but this was like overwhelming, but beautiful, rich, yeah, really, really great. Unfortunately, fortunately, we have computers, we have qualitative data software, so I could code it and then analyzing the stories. I would keep track of so this Atlas TI, this data, the software, gave codes to the documents and to the fragments in the diaries, and I would keep track of them. You know, whenever I came to a certain claim or a statement or conclusion based on these stories, I would, for my own sake, for the analysis' sake, keep track of the references, intending initially to, when everything would be analyzed, to delete all the codes. But in the process, I started to feel sorry about, to regret having to take out all these beautiful stories. And I was thinking, maybe somebody's interested in particularly this issue. How great for this person if he or she could look at the more details behind it. So I started to think of leaving the codes in, which would mean that all this beautiful material would not be cut off from my analysis, would still be there, part of the final product. And for those interested in particular subjects or topics would be able to gain the more detailed insights. I also was happy with the idea of, you know, I wanted to get to the bottom of this, and it was just me with all these stories, and I was interpreting each fragment and combining the fragments and interpreting the combinations, but it was just me. And I really liked the idea that others could look at the fragments that I've been looking at, maybe come to different conclusions. So it makes the process of analysis a bit more transparent in scientific text, not so much anthropological text, but scientific text in general. There's this tendency to dehumanize the process of data production, of analysis, of taking away the scientists, so to say. And there's this, so we speak of the data tell us, or studies reveal, blah, 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 to add authority to the findings. And I actually think it adds authority if indeed readers can like weigh what made me to think of certain conclusions. And there's the potential of new insights from other people with other backgrounds, other experiences, looking at the fragments, reinterpreting it, coming up with new conclusions. So then I started to realize in this process that I started to think, okay, I want this. Then I started to realize at one point, oh, that would mean, in fact, having to open up all the field notes. But I saw an advantage to that too, because that would mean that it is so rich. You know, I just took out the aspect to answer my research question, but there's so much more in that. If you just write down everything that occurs in a village for 1 year. And if indeed this would be available for secondary use, that would potentially safeguard these people that I studied or similar people from the kind of harm that I felt I was doing to them with this research. Throughout this year, they must have felt uncomfortable with the threat of me coming to their compound again with my pen and pencil and my questions. they rightfully feared, for example, also that my presence in the village would attract thieves to the village. Children were afraid of me. They cried if they saw this ghost-like creature. I suspect that parents used me as a boogeyman too in their child-rearing endeavors. So they reinforced this fear. So these children have been living for a year with this monster being present, the chief. Well, there are more. Okay, I have to go quick now. Lastly, these people living in such horrible circumstances are the least heard of. Because, you know, it is so uncomfortable as a researcher to spend that time there. It makes it attractive to come in and out and do interviews and never get to the bottom of these, so to their lives. Okay, but, oh shit, I still have so much to say. Okay, this came, of course, with very difficult questions, so difficult that it became tempting not to do it at all. My considerations, I did ask permission. Well, I tried in various ways to make sure that these people knew what I was doing, and they gave permission. But still, of course, it was my responsibility. They have no means of knowing what exactly it meant, it entailed. My considerations were, okay, most of the research material is public knowledge. Well, within such a tightly knit community, it's very difficult to keep anything secret. And I anonymized everything, the locality, the names of the people, even in some cases where I felt that there was harmful, personal, too secretive information that was even though I anonymized it, still too recognizable. I even altered the raw data at some places. For example, in one case, the worst thing I did was making 2 women out of 1 woman. And I have photos in the dissertation, but I don't put any pseudonyms to it. I do quickly want to show how I did it, what it looks like. Okay, I'll get this one up here again. So I had all these ideas about a fancy app where one could also click on, for example, the name of a woman and then her biography would pop up. But it was costly and it was not durable, because somebody would have to keep updating it. So I was told the most durable format is just a plain old simple PDF file. So that's what it was. So you can download it from these 2 repositories. But I did it already because it's a very big file. Now I hope, no, shit. How are we going to see this? Any idea? I want now this to show this the PDF file.
Move it over. It's going to look at it down there. See that down there?
Okay, and can I still? So this is just a random page of the, of my dissertation. So I just want to quickly show. So let's take this sentence. Even when proposals, sexual relationship proposals, came from men unknown to them, many women accepted without hesitation. Then you have the P2 documents, or those written by my research assistant. You can just click on it. Okay, I don't know why this is not working now.
It's not working. Oh, sorry. Well, it's. Oh, well. It's not there. Here's the.
Is it very big now or so?
No, I don't know. I can't see it. Oh, here it is.
When we just tried it on this computer, it did work.
It just worked a second ago. The what icon? I don't know. Where's blinking? No, can't see it. Yeah. Yeah. Let's just go ahead and finish.
Yeah, but I'm finished. I just wanted to show how it works.
That's all I wanted to do, too.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's all we got,
Good.
unfortunately. Sorry.
Okay, we have to skip the fun part, sorry. All right, that's it then.
Well, tell them how you could,
Sorry.
tell them how to download it so they can play with it, they can see it.
Yeah, and then I need this one again.
Well, afterwards, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, cool.
All right.
Thank you. Sorry about that. All right. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Set up the next one. So our next speaker is Dr. Sean Bruno from Western Washington University. The title of his piece is Ethnographic Evidence Public or Private? Opportunities and Challenges to Contemporary Data Sharing Requirements with American Indian Tribes. Dr. Bruno.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. This is shaping up to be an interesting session. My talk today might be of particular interest to graduate students as you're setting up your projects. I want to share sort of some mishaps that I had when I was developing a research project and now how I'm working with them several years after completing the dissertation. The idea for my project actually took place over two instances. The first was when I was meeting with the leader, a religious leader at Isleta del Sur Pueblo. That's a tribe in West Texas that I partner with for research. And I was sitting with the religious leader and he handed me a book with a page that had a post-it note in it, and he said, "Hey Sean, read this." The marked text was a direct quote from a previous anthropologist that had worked at the tribe not too long before I was there. And the text basically stated that the tribal community was not at all ready to conduct research. So the captain asked me what I thought of that passage, and I replied rather diplomatically as I handed him back the book. I said, well, it's offensive and it's not the experience that I'm having right now at the community. And he responded saying that that anthropologist should have asked questions. He should have shared more. He should have thought of this as a partnership. Or as he first put it while pointing at the passage, that's bullshit. So at that moment, I confirmed my interest to share as much as possible with the tribe, and it turned into a great partnership. The second event actually took place one evening at a previous AAA's not long ago. While sitting with colleagues from graduate school, I asked rather innocently, hey, what do you all think about sharing your research data? You know, field notes or interviews when you submit a manuscript. You know, don't you sometimes read an article and wish you could read the entire interview? The overwhelming response from my colleagues at the table was that sharing our data is a terrible idea. IRB would not allow it. It has to be anonymous. No one would understand my field notes. You really had to be there. And one colleague summed it up rather succinctly, and she said, that's bullshit. So with these two separate occurrences, I decided to start sorting through the piles of opinions out there and see what data sharing was really about. Now, in 2003, the National Institutes of Health published the final requirements and guide for data sharing, explaining that data sharing is, quote, essential for expedited translation of research results into knowledge, products, and procedures that will improve human health. Now, many anthropologists and cultural anthropologists that work with IRBs, in other words, all of us, balk at the NIH requirements and either limit or completely embargo the ethnographic data because of concerns regarding privacy and anonymity of research data regarding the populations we work with. As is argued, such data and the evidences produced are protected under federal HIPAA requirements, or at a minimum, the anthropology-oriented ethical norms regarding anonymity. At the same time, many tribal nations, including the nation I partner with for health-related, community-based participatory research, encourage that research partners submit all of the data collected to archives at the conclusion of studies, often without giving any guidelines regarding format or privacy restrictions. So today I'm arguing that data sharing, new as it is to cultural anthropology, presents an opportunity for those of us that work with tribes in partnered research. I argue that data sharing is a way to decolonize the discipline's historical trend of knowledge extraction by challenging our notions of control, ownership, and management of ethnographic data. But long-term sharing of data in tribal archives presents unique ethical and infrastructural challenges to preservation and access, particularly when striving to accommodate tribal requirements in the context of IRB and HIPAA regulations. So today I'm briefly going to talk about my research with Isleta del Sur Pueblo, pointing out the types of data I collected and the vague data sharing requirement I agreed upon and which I'm now trying to figure out. I'll then shift to discuss the National Institutes of Health guidelines for sharing, and I'll discuss some of the challenges and limitations we may encounter as anthropologists that work in a health arena. I'll close with 10 recommendations, 10's a nice number, that every researcher, particularly graduate students, should consider when developing data sharing within a tribal research context. Now, the material that I talk about today very briefly is available in another publication. You can certainly take a look at it. I explained that my research used community-based participatory research to examine type 2 diabetes prevention efforts at Isleta del Sur Pueblo, a federally recognized tribe in Texas. And over the course of a decade, I developed a very close relationship that ultimately accumulated in 2 years of partnered research. At the conclusion of the research, I argued, among other things, that the Pueblo is developing what I call emergent practices for diabetes prevention that are potentially impactful ways to address long-term diabetes prevention across the reservation. In the case of this slide right here, you can see one of the emergent practices that has been emerging for hundreds of years, religious dancing. And this is actually from a public event, and the image is allowed to be shared. Now, my findings were based on a wide variety of data that are commonly used in medical anthropology and public health. And they might include archival records from the Smithsonian, El Paso museums, from the Pueblo, from 300 to 400 typed pages of field notes in Microsoft Word, and an assortment of 6 paper journals, in 41 structured and semi-structured interviews in MP3 transcribed formats, both in paper and printed in paper and in digital formats, surveys of health and behavior in Excel and digital formats, 24-hour food recalls in paper and Excel, environmental scans of local supermarkets, also in Excel, and spreadsheets are printed out, non-identifiable paper records, about 3,000 photographs in raw JPEG and print formats, a web page, and a series of research update PDFs, where every month I notified the tribe what had been completed in the past month, what I was currently working on, and what we were going to do in the next month. Not to mention piles of literature, school papers, and the final dissertation. Now, the platforms and software I used to organize all this material is very familiar. Microsoft Word, Excel, NVivo, Mac OS 9 and 10, a now dated Mac PowerBook. In some cases, for some data, Dropbox, a lot of thumb drives, enough offsite encrypted backup server, and my trusty locked file cabinet, now in my office at Western. To be honest, I'm still finding a couple of field notes in boxes after my move from the US Southwest to the Pacific Northwest. All right, so what about data sharing? What exactly did I agree to? Well, I had an idea that the tribe actually would own all of the data, and I suggested it. I said, you all own all of the data. It's your knowledge, your information. And they thought that was a great idea, but we didn't really think through what that meant. In our discussions, we pretty much agreed that all research data belonged to the tribe, and that manuscripts and publications, including the dissertation, had to be approved by the tribe. The dissertation would be embargoed for several years. The tribe would review any manuscripts and publications, and I would make all efforts to share the data in an ethical and timely manner. I graduated 3 years ago, so I'm working on that last point. So what exactly do we mean by data sharing? Well, I'm preparing an NIH grant, so I thought I'd look at those criteria. Data sharing is the process of organizing and sharing final research data so that others can use the findings for future studies. It does not include lab notebooks or procedures or data sets and the such. And as the NIH expectedly states, they give attention to biomedical material, and they distill their suggestions or requirements really into 5 areas. They say that all data should be shared, stating, quote, all data should be considered for sharing. Data that constitute unique resources especially should be shared unless there is a strong reason not to. Such data are difficult, if not impossible, to replicate because of cost, special circumstances, or rare populations. Now, certainly our qualitative ethnographic data, particularly with American Indian communities, might fit these guidelines. However, the NIH also explains that less likely candidates for sharing data might include material from small studies, including research procedures that are not replicated, or from data that might identify human subjects. So, it gets a lot trickier. So the NIH supports data sharing, but not so much if the human subjects are going to be identified. But in a tribal context where the tribe owns the knowledge and information, it's a different question. Sovereign nations have the right to regulate what takes place in their national boundaries and certainly have the right to retain data. As researchers, then, our challenge is to figure out how to ensure that tribes receive the data while also protecting the individuals that participated in research. So the NIH does give several guidelines for protecting the rights of human subjects. An important part is certainly sensitivity regarding privacy and anonymity of individuals, particularly for health research. But the collection of sensitive data does not preclude sharing. Sensitive data might be shared if there is a higher sense of security during collection, analysis, and storage, and if consideration is given when preparing data sets to be shared for broader use. So what exactly constitutes sensitive data? Well, it really varies by context, population, and time. Illegal and sexual behaviors are almost always considered sensitive. Measures of alcohol use, particularly if alcohol use is taboo in a community, all sorts of diseases. But not surprisingly, the NIH discussion of sensitive data fails to mention types of activities or places, place names within a tribal context which might be considered highly sensitive or even secretive. This is certainly an oversight, but I'm sure the war captain I spoke with might have something else to call it. In this sense, restriction of data might be very useful, restricting information in the data set, and more importantly, perhaps restricting access to the data that we share as anthropologists. Now, the NIH also gives guidelines for HIPAA regulations, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I won't go into detail today, except to say that almost all identifiable information is removed from health records. One very useful thing the NIH discusses is data sharing agreements. And in the interest of time, I'll just say I recommend to graduate students that you please consider data sharing agreements. Who can use the information? When will it be shared? And will there be any penalties for breaking this? A particularly unique consideration for tribes that are considering how to flex their sovereignty into the realm of research. Now, data enclaves might be a particularly useful way to share information to tribes, yet still restrict information to it. To gain access to restricted data, researchers and others, perhaps even community members, need to submit detailed descriptions of their projects and include reasons why they want to access the information, and then they can only use it on site and cannot remove the information unless they're allowed to for certain reasons. Data enclaves, I think, are particularly useful for tribes, though many tribes do not have the resources to maintain those. So all of the information in the NIH guidelines were particularly useful, but as I now am forming a way to share the data with my research partners, we're starting to see that there are a lot of questions we have to ask, and I encourage the graduate students and other researchers to consider these. First, ask tribes if they wish to retain data. Think of NAGPRA. Oftentimes, tribes do not have the resources or desire to retain information or certain resources. Don't make that assumption, but contact contact your partners and see if they want it. Consider when and how study participants will give consent to data sharing. They may not wish their information to be kept in an archive for 500 to 700 years. Consider who owns the data during the research, and does that information that you are giving have to include the tools, the software, the codes that are used in the analysis. Definitely consider a timeline for development of sharing programs, something I certainly could work on. Consider what formats it should be kept in, whether it's paper and electronic, if there should be an archive or an enclave, if the data will be considered in original form, redacted, or anonymized, if there will be standard formats and a guide to make the other researchers understand your data, and who will maintain the data and the physical access, certainly, as well as developing access and use policies. So as we move forward, the NIH application really gives little room and consideration. The most challenging question is really, how are we supposed to explain such complex questions in our own research? The NIH gives a brief paragraph of space in order to explain your data sharing plan, and certainly data sharing in tribal contexts is far more complex. So today I talked a little bit about the tribal public, not the general public, for data sharing. And I argued that as anthropologists, we really have to work with tribes to share our data and essentially turn it over so that it can be used for future studies. Sharing data will certainly continue the work of decolonizing our discipline by removing the veil of secrecy that sometimes is seen by community members when we're conducting research. If tribes have been keepers of their knowledge for time immemorial, they can and should be keepers of the scientific data and knowledge that their populations create. And really am looking forward to some questions and some comments. Thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker. Yes. Please, let's get you set up. Okay.
This is the
What?
this is for advancing.
I think so, that's, no.
Hi, I'm Ed Shortman with my colleagues Ellen Bell, Jenna Nolt, and Patricia Urban. We're the authors of this paper, and I thank you all for coming. I was pleased to hear myself described along with this eminent panel as a creative researcher. Unfortunately, that's not true. What I am is I'm old. And one of the things that happens when you get older, sometimes happens, you begin to wonder what it was all about. What was all that research really all about? And so my answer was that to think of the archaeological study of human history as a sort of a cathedral project, which means that research pursued by specific investigators add incrementally to what we know, but we never will see the end of that construction. Traditionally, we've collaborated in creating and raising our intellectual monuments by sharing knowledge through publications. Though valuable, these means of communication are limited in that they are rarely comprehensive, they're almost always expensive, and they are invariably written in a language that we within our communities of practice understand, but which other people find hard to decode. Consequently, building our cathedral has relied on forms of collaboration that restrict what is shared and to whom it's distributed. Accelerating rates of discovery, enhancing the range of interpretive models for understanding what we find, we argue are best accomplished by promoting information equality. What we mean by that is facilitating free and open access to all basic archaeological field data generated by a project as widely and cheaply as possible. Therefore, people with varied interests and skills could mine these records, pursuing topics the original investigators had not the interest nor the time to consider. So achieving information equality is best done by posting these bodies online, where they can be accessed free of charge. We're going to review a little bit here what we've been trying to do along those lines. Now, the data in question resulted from field research that Bell, Urban, and me have conducted together and with others in the Naco, Lower Cacalapa, Middle Ulua, and El Paraiso valleys in northwestern Honduras, beginning in 1983 and continuing through 2013. all these valleys within about 90 kilometers of each other. The results of this work comprises the Four Valleys Project, which does kind of sound like a Chinese hydroelectric dam, but it is this project. This work recorded 941 sites in the process of surveying 180 square kilometers. Fully 180 of these settlements were excavated, yielding over 1 million analyzed artifacts and revealing a history of occupation that spans 1200 BC through the 17th century. It also generated more than 256,000 records, including field notes, cards describing the proveniences of recovered artifacts, field drawings, and such. Archaeological research produces lots of documents because studying the past is inherently destructive. Inferring what people did and when they did it is achieved by analyzing the horizontal and vertical relations among recovered items. These relations are obliterated when objects are removed from the ground. Considerable time is therefore devoted to recording the context of artifacts before they are bagged and transported to the lab. It's from these records of what was found in which soils at what depth and with what other items that ancient behaviors could be inferred and changes in those practices described. Organizing and displaying digitally these materials in ways that are intelligible to those who never took part in the original research are some of the major obstacles to achieving information equality in archaeology. Now, most of the Four Valleys records were not born digital. They were created before computers were consistently used in archaeological field research or in formats that have long since been consigned to the digital scrap heap. When digitizing the Four Valleys materials began in 2005, there were really no established formats, protocols, or platforms to guide the work. In other words, we were working blind. We experimented with creating such protocols, which really still do not exist in a general sense in archaeology. But we started experimenting with creating such protocols in 2015, supported by a grant from the Mellon Foundation. During the 2015, the four of us created a pilot digital archive composed of all records from 3 sites and most from a 4th that were excavated in Naco Valley back in 1992. These files are now available through Kenyon's institutional repository, Digital Kenyon. In close collaboration with library staff, the investigators established digitization standards and workflows to build this experimental archive. We built custom descriptors, otherwise known as metadata fields, to describe the collection, mirroring the organization used to preserve crucial information on artifact context in the field. This was done using the Dublin Core metadata standard. The metadata comprises a matrix of intersecting dimensions of location, horizontal and vertical, material classes, different kinds of artifacts, the behavioral significance of the unearthed material, for example, things found in architectural fill versus objects found where they were last used, and the records in which this information is documented, for example, notes and drawings. For example, recovered artifacts are designated with a code that describes the region in which they were found, PVN for the Naco Valley, the site or portion from which they retrieved, given by an operation number, the trench in which they appeared, identified by a sub-operation letter, so each operation consists of at least one sub-operation, and their horizontal and vertical location within that excavation, given by a lot number. Lots are collection units in sub-operations. So an investigator who was interested in looking at this archive might start in Digital Kenyon with looking at the excavation reports. These reports summarize the results of all digging conducted at a site. Reviewing the material, the researcher might decide that she's interested in learning more about Structure 2 from Site 418, particularly interesting building. The excavation report points the reader to the investigator's original field notes, in this case those written by Neil Ross. These notes describe the course of the investigations at Structure 2, the choices Ross made in directing the work, and provide a detailed description of the building along with a history of its multiple renovations. The reader would then also be directed to look at these scale field drawings, which depict the forms and horizontal and vertical relations among recovered soils and features. This shows a top-down view. Structure 2 is up there in the upper right corner, and there's a cross-section view looking across Structure 2, again based on what was revealed in excavations. Now, to find out what artifacts were associated with the building and its different occupation phases, the investigator could consult the lot inventories from the trenches, sub-operations 418B and E. Each lot card describes the collection unit's horizontal and vertical location, behavioral significance, and artifact contents. Detailed descriptions and drawings of artifacts that were well preserved are found among the sub-operation 418B and D catalog sheets. By navigating the archive in this way, our investigator can reconstruct what Structure 2 looked like at various points in its history, how that changed over time, what artifacts were associated with these different phases, and based on patterning among these remains, a researcher could infer what activities took place on and around the edifice. And alternatively, an investigator could study variations within a particular artifact class across multiple sites. They would do so by calling up all catalog sheets, like the one you see here, tagged with the identifier uniquely linked to that particular material. The goal in general is to create a comprehensive collection of field records that people can navigate to explore topics of interest to them. I'm going to look briefly here at two examples of how this is actually being used. One is in terms of teaching. One of the greatest challenges to teaching archaeology to undergraduates is giving them the chance to put what they are learning into practice in interpreting field data. Usually what we do, this is accomplished by getting people into the field in some kind of field school, but that is not possible for all students. If they have to pursue gainful employment over the summers, then they simply do not have that opportunity, and they end up then behind their peers who do have that opportunity. So for example, at Stanislaus State University, where Ellen Bell teaches, about 60% of the students are classified as low income, 75% are first-generation college students. Given the obstacles they've already overcome just to get into the classroom, participating in a research experience is often beyond their reach. It is in situations like this that the pedagogical value of this collection becomes crystal clear. Since 2008, nearly 70 Stanislaus State students have used materials in the archive to explore questions of identity in classic period, about AD 250 to 1000, Mesoamerica, as part of a class taught by Bell. Students work in groups of 3 to 4. They make sense of primary data within the archive. Each team then composes a formal description of an ancient structure and its associated materials, reports their findings in a symposium format, and using their results, each person writes a term paper that explores identity formation in the region and its archaeological correlates. Now, the premise here is that people in the present and past know themselves through their interactions with others, and those dealings are often mediated through the use and display of portable and immovable objects. As the undergraduates explore how ancient people used pots, stone tools, and buildings to construct and convey who they were, they come to appreciate how they do much the same. Students thereby become keenly aware of the ways in which their cherished notions of self are founded on objects we often take for granted. The past thus speaks to the present, just as completed reports become parts of the archives on which other researchers can draw. As the semester progresses, there is a heck of a lot of complaining, but the students become devoted to understanding their buildings. The experience of working with all of these records builds a sort of personal connection that's not often seen when working with secondary sources. Undergraduates report feeling proud of what they've been able to accomplish. Some of them have been able to go on to graduate programs in anthropology or museum studies or related disciplines. Some are working with the Forest Service or cultural resource management firms. Whatever they end up doing, these projects and their successful completion help build pride in a student's ability to accomplish something difficult. It helps encourage lateral thinking, collaborative abilities, and levels of professionalism that go beyond traditional classroom experiences. You get pretty close to the field school experience just without getting quite so dirty. In terms of research, my colleague Dr. Lauren Schwartz and I have been using the archive to explore how the Naco Valley's inhabitants instantiated some aspects of their social identities through how they built their domiciles. The premise here is that people realize important objectives by collaborating with others through social networks. These consist of enduring interpersonal ties extending over varying distances. They comprise communities of practice linked by common understandings and identities enacted through quotidian and dramatic activities. Identifying prehistoric social nets requires recognizing their material signifiers and how those items figured in interactions that define network membership. Architectural forms are especially significant in constituting social webs, in part because they constitute the intimate physical spaces in which we learn who we are by how we are related to others. Also, building forms and styles often physically proclaim social affiliations. So what we're looking for, we're looking for patterns of architectural variation across multiple sites that might be interpreted as expressions of ancient social webs that transcended site boundaries. So one architectural arrangement found among settlements in the Terminal Classic, 8800 to 1000 Naco Valley, consists of stone-faced platforms that support 3 small rooms set in a line, which are backed by a 4th compartment. These constructions, which we've called tripartites, were residences based on their associated artifacts and built-in furniture. They comprise about 13% of the 211 extensively cleared Terminal Classic Naco Valley buildings, and they're found at 10 sites of all sites and locations in the valley. So building a residence structured as a tripartite was a choice and exercised by those to whom this architectural arrangement was significant. Its replication suggests that it may signify a social network that was not restricted, transcended individual households and fragmented individual households and transcended the boundaries of specific sites, suggesting that the Terminal Classic Naco Valley social landscape was actually not so much characterized by a series of distinct sites as by a matrix of overlapping social networks materialized in varied ways. Pursuing this kind of research means you have to have detailed access to a lot of very specific information about building forms. It's not likely to appear in most publications. It would simply be prohibitive to publish that kind of detail. This kind of data has made it possible for Schwartz and me to investigate a pattern which I, who was part of the original team investigating the Naco Valley, never recognized. And that's the point, to see patterns that the original investigators didn't see, so we can learn something new that the original investigators didn't perceive. Just a couple of points to conclude all this. First, uploading comprehensive collections of field records enriches teaching considerably. It allows students to follow the research process through from start to finish. They also learn how to make reasoned judgments based on ambiguous data. And if you want a snapshot description of life, I think that's a pretty good one. So learning to do this with archaeological data may provide them with the skills that will come in handy whatever they do in life. Second, posting the archives to the internet promotes information equality. All those with an internet connection can pursue novel research that enriches our understanding of the diverse historical trajectories that unfolded in varied areas. This is especially important in places like the Four Valleys, where roughly 80% of all the sites we ever knew about are gone. This is learning about those who lived in these basins learning about those who lived in these basins depends on studying what survives, and that's these records. The future of archaeology will depend on working with just these sorts of archives, and we should develop ways of doing so. Third, the process of converting field records to digital files, organizing and uploading them requires cooperation among investigators and library staff, all acting as equal partners. Such collaboration and learning from each other not only results in posting valuable data, but it encourages innovative approaches to sharing records. And finally, the records can be used by those other than anthropologists, for example, geographers, art historians. It also raises, as Sean pointed out, the questions of ethics. Who has the right to post, consult, and publish accounts based on field records? Information equality is great, but who really benefits from accessing a project's files? We've been working closely with representatives of the Honduran government, the Honduran National University, and community leaders where we conduct field research to guarantee that we hear and incorporate their input into the creation of the archive. At present, some of the first undergraduates to be studying for university-level degrees in anthropology in Honduras are using the archive to write their theses. Their feedback on the collection structure has been invaluable. We envision continuing these conversations for many years to come. We've also made provisions to ensure that future generations of Hondurans will always be able to consult directly with the Four Valleys curators, whoever they may be, about issues of access to and display of different data classes as their sensibilities and understanding of these data change. Achieving all these ends requires developing a culture of sharing data openly and freely among all interested parties. It is only in this way that the work conducted by a few investigators can contribute significantly to the education and research agendas of many more. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ed. Our next speaker is Dr. Smiliana Uvois, right? Did I get it? I'm sorry. Digital Workflow in the Humanities and Social Sciences.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah. Yes, my name is Miliana Antonijević Uboa, and I will be talking about the digital workflow in the humanities and social sciences based on my fieldwork, which was conducted in the period 2011-2016 as part of 4 research projects that I carried out at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences in Amsterdam and at the Penn State University. So the fieldwork included site visits to 23 educational research and funding institutions in the United States and Europe, and it involved 196 participants. Through interviews, observations, contextual inquiry sessions, and surveys, I examined how scholars across disciplines, including sciences, social sciences, and humanities, engage with digital technologies in their work. Such a comparative perspective enabled me to understand the specifics of digital research workflows in the humanities and social sciences, which was the focus of my study. So in order to understand and analytically break down complexity of those workflows, I developed the following model. The research activities presented in the model were not intended to be either comprehensive or mutually exclusive, but rather to serve as an analytical tool for understanding the complexity of scholarly research process. The results showed that digital tools and resources have different roles and levels of integration at various phases of the scholarly workflow, as well as across academic disciplines. In the humanities and social sciences, digital technologies are indispensable for finding and organizing information, as well as in writing research outputs. But their use in analytical and interpretative practices is still not fully established. And this is where practices of scholars in the humanities and social sciences on the one hand and scholars in the sciences on the other hand still diverge most significantly, as this diagram illustrates. Now, when we start going across the workflow and look at the activities of finding information, we see that finding information electronically is a daily practice of contemporary scholars, regardless of their disciplinary background or level of technical proficiency. Across disciplines, the path towards finding information online commonly starts with Google search and Google Scholar, especially for scholars engaged in discovery search. Library databases are more typical access points for scholars engaged in confirmation search, that is a known item search. Scholars who participated in this study also use more specialized online search services such as movie databases, newspaper, online archives, museum collections, and so on. Also important is that humanists and social scientists increasingly use digital technologies to collect empirical research data and other primary sources such as archival documents. In the social sciences, scholars with whom I talked regularly use online surveys, Skype interviewing, digital audio and video recording, smartphones, and notebooks to collect their data. For example, an associate professor of anthropology described the data collection process of her team in the following way. We had about 7,000 students, and we collected data using smartphones. We also observed teaching the lessons, and we used digitally recorded video and audio recordings of the teachers. In the humanities, digital technologies have become important for collecting materials in physical archives. Wherever it is allowed, humanities scholars take digital photos of archival materials, mostly by using their cell phone cameras, and store those materials for further use. As a professor of history says, the great thing about the American Philosophical Society Library is they allow people to take digital photos of everything. So when I went into the archive, I took photos and photos and photos. Now, the part of scholarly workflow closely related to finding and collecting research data and materials is organizing those materials in useful and reliable ways and storing them for further use. Two main ways of storing and organizing research data and materials include using computer hard drives and cloud-based services such as Dropbox or Box. When storing and organizing secondary sources like journal articles, scholars also use citation managers, most commonly Zotero and EndNote. My studies show that using digital tools to store and organize research materials had positive effects on scholars' work, enabling them to keep their research data and materials in hand and to access them at any time and place, thus making scholarly work much more portable. At the same time, however, reorientation towards digital scholarship required researchers to significantly adjust their storing and organizing practices developed for print-based materials. As a professor of French explained, I had a complete breakdown of my organization system. In my not so long ago past, it was open the file drawer and here is all the materials used for some particular study. Things are now online, becomes too complicated. A similar difficulty arises with storing and organizing digital photos that researchers take in the archives. Namely, they often return from the archive with an overload of digital photos that require a lot of storage space and organizational effort. As this historian of American literature said, there is 189 files, my research from last fall. It comes back on your phone, it's all mixed with your kids' baby pictures. I'll turn them into multiple page PDFs for each archival object and name the file something that is useful. That's how I organize my archival stuff. By the way, not everyone names those files in ways that are useful, which causes even more problems when you're trying to find something. In some cases, the biggest problem related to storing and organizing research data and materials in the humanities and social sciences is data privacy and security, as we already heard. So scholars reported that privacy issues and IRB regulations required them to use university storage services instead of commercial ones, which caused various problems. For instance, institutional repositories could not hold big audio-video files, did not have good revision capacities, and so on. The extent to which privacy issues influence storage practices can best be observed in the case of scholars whose work requires such a high level of security that neither commercial nor institutional services prove sufficiently reliable. An associate professor of psychology explained that her data are stored on a password-protected hard drive kept under lock and key in her filing cabinet. The biggest thing is security, she says. If it wasn't completely secure, it couldn't be used. I don't actually know of anybody working with footage of elementary school students that doesn't use the lock and key method. Now, when we talk about archiving data and materials, the majority of scholars consulted in this study reported that they actively archive and backup research materials important to them, but actual preservation practices varied across disciplinary lines. One significant difference is that humanists and social scientists frequently store Word documents, while their colleagues in the sciences store data files and presentation files. In both of those academic groups, the most commonly archived materials are PDF files, unsurprisingly, which might be linked to scholars' expectations concerning their longest-lasting scholarly contribution, as I will explain in a few minutes. Now, another significant difference is that although the majority of scholars in the humanities and social sciences consider archiving a vital element of their workflow, they suffer loss of research materials on a larger scale than scholars in the sciences. A significant number of my interviewees reported having inaccessible files, most commonly as a result of not migrating to new data formats. And these are actual photos from my fieldwork, so I mean, I really had respondents who still use tape, cassettes, and things like that. Scholars in the humanities and social sciences also reported more often that they destroyed their digital data, as they do not have technical capacity for long-term preservation and access. I can destroy the data after 5 years once it's published, and I do, says this associate professor of political science. But if you think about it, these are rich data sets. It's a shame to destroy them, but what else do you do? It is important to note, however, that long-term data preservation and management is a problem in the sciences too. Here is how a professor of chemistry describes his experience. If I need to archive a large amount of data, the infrastructure that would allow me to do that is not available at my home institution. So I have to buy the storage space and manage it myself. All these examples show that data archiving and management is a big problem across disciplines as a result of inadequate or insufficient institutional services, privacy and sustainability issues, fragmentation across services and platforms, and the lack of funding. Commonly, scholars with whom I talk complain that funders require strategies for data management and long-term access, but rarely provide funding for that. Finally, the issue of long-term access is also connected to scholars' visions of their academic legacy, as I mentioned. Regardless of a disciplinary background, scholars envision publications, books and peer-reviewed articles as their longest-lasting legacy, and as a result, their preservation activities are often focused on publications. So here we have a professor, associate professor of gender studies, who says, I see my lasting scholarly output as what is validated and recognized by the academy. Articles, chapters in books, or a book. And almost the same words by a professor of physics. I think about my legacy largely in terms of the papers that I write, and that is probably a lack of imagination on my part, but it is the currency of the field. Now, another way in which archiving is sometimes achieved is through sharing research data and materials. A number of scholars with whom I talked indicated that sharing information on the web or in other ways is their way of archiving materials. A common narrative juxtaposes scholars in the sciences as sharing-oriented versus humanists and social scientists as territorial. The findings of my study confirmed such a view to some extent, but also suggested that the origins of those differences are more complex than the stereotype implies. So as we see here, in the sciences, scholars do indeed share more. A majority of scholars describe data sharing as indispensable. They commonly share data, code, research articles, preprints, and so on. In the humanities and social sciences, sharing is less established for various reasons. For instance, scholars engaged in ethnographic research explain that their work presumes developing trust with study participants, some of whom reveal intensely personal matters. So sharing even anonymized data would violate participants' privacy and trust. Now, what I would also like to stress is that in this study, data sharing was correlated with the scholar's current academic status much more than with his or her disciplinary background. Among my interviewees, the lack of sharing was most common among tenure-track scholars across disciplines, as the following quote illustrates. Unless there is some obvious reason to share the data, I don't see any benefit in doing so. I don't want someone to reanalyze it and then publish it. A professor of engineering, just not to make you confused, not an anthropologist or someone from the humanities. So, in conclusion, my research shows that digital technologies have different roles and levels of integration at various phases of the workflow. Accordingly, the perceived or actual influence of these technologies differ across individual segments of the workflow, as well as across academic disciplines. As we have seen throughout the presentation, those disciplinary differences can be significant, and therefore both technical and policy solutions that we develop need to support them by identifying and addressing discipline-specific needs, practices, and values. As anthropologists, we know that disciplinary values and assumptions profoundly influence response to scholarly transformation, including the adoption of new digital technologies. Equally important is to keep in mind that integration of digital technologies in one phase of the scholarly workflow influences other segments. We've seen, for instance, that collecting and archiving research data electronically brings a set of new methodological, epistemological, and ethical challenges. I would therefore like to say that instead of skill-based training in digital scholarship that we currently have in form of different workshops and so on, educational digital scholarship for faculty and students in the humanities and social sciences needs a comprehensive framework encompassing understanding of digital and other types of data, fostering critical reflection of digital objects of inquiry, comprehending the influence of algorithmic processes on investigation, and so on. Finally, it is crucial for scholars in the humanities and social sciences to get involved in digital knowledge production as users, producers, and as I hope our panel shows, as analysts. Digital scholarship is not merely supported by technology, but constituted through it. Research tools shape both the object of inquiry and the ways of knowing it. Consequently, our involvement is not just a technical or a policy issue, but a profound question concerning the kinds of research practices and ways of knowing the digital tools enable and promote. It is the question about the configuration of technology that shapes both how we know and what we can know. For more information about the study and my findings and so on, there is my recently published book, Among Digital Humanists, an ethnographic study of digital knowledge production, and I also welcome all questions and comments that you might have. Thank you.
So now our discussants will come up and give us some feedback. First of all is Dr. Lisa Claggett from the University of Kentucky.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this panel. It's exciting to see the kinds of work that's being done in actually producing and making accessible data in different kinds of ways, so I'm happy to be a part of this. I will keep my comments pretty brief because there's two of us discussing today, and we're a little bit short on time, and it would be nice to have some questions. But I'd like to point out a couple things about these presentations that I very much enjoyed, especially the actual scholars producing data for access. So Jenneke? Yes, so she presented a book, or her dissertation, that has hyperlinks to her data, which I think is one of the most exciting ways to make data live and make it more accessible and to make the public, our readers, whoever has access to our publications, aware that this is a model for sharing data. So I think that's a really important example. I also like Ed, our archaeologist representative, and his team talking about the importance of making data available in the classroom. That's another way to raise awareness and, as he so rightly points out, train our students to use data in a way that has meaning beyond just looking at the data itself. And then Professor Bruno Sean, there we go. Speaking of bringing data back to native populations, I think that's a really kind of unrecognized model of sharing among people who don't work necessarily with Native Americans or native populations. For instance, I come at this from working in Zambia on a long-term project started in the 50s, and the kind of historical context there doesn't make people think of actually wanting to own the data, although working with more people from the Zambian context, there's more awareness of that. But the native populations have really come a long way in requiring data ownership, often to the extent that can be a little frightening for a student. I think I've had experiences with students working with native populations where the native groups insist on ownership of the data and control of what is published, and that's a frightening element for a student trying to finish a degree, which requires some negotiation that often funders have helped with, which we are grateful for. So these are all great examples of how to get data out in the public in ways that we can begin to conscientize our colleagues that data sharing, data preservation is important. There's a couple areas that I have particular interest in based on my work in Zambia that has to do with the role of security and anonymity balanced with accessibility and reuse. So in all of these cases, the data is presented such that it's a kind of a standalone project. I'm part of a longitudinal project where kinship and being able to trace family relationships and people across time, family and relationships across time is profound. And in the process of anonymizing, I lose that context, which makes the data at a certain level unusable to any future researcher. It stands alone as valuable, but the question remains, how can we make data available for different kinds of populations? So are there ways, and I have a vision, this is how I think of it, I have a vision that there is a way to have multi-layered technology that allows us to have multi-layered anonymity, so that for the broadest sense, we could have our data available in a highly anonymized way, and then through the process of applications for more detailed access, and including perhaps with a new IRB application, then we could reveal a layer that allows people to see names or trace kinship relationships. I have yet to see the software analysis that can allow multi-layers, the way we might imagine GIS mapping having layers, but I know it's possible, and I believe we will find an answer. So that's one of my visions. Let's see. Oh, and then another component to my vision is, particularly Janneke spoke about how her dissertation links to her data analyzed at a coded level, which is really exciting because that helps people learn what coding looks like. A lot of students actually don't know that. People who read our literature, our publications don't really understand maybe the kind of families of analysis that we're using. So that's great, but another exciting path is to then be able to build on that level of analysis with people using those codes and yet adding their own codes as another layer of analysis and secondary use. So that's another component of my vision that also depends on a technological development in conjunction with software developers, I think. Let's see. There's a few other things that weren't really brought up in this context, but everybody mentions them kind of in text, in kind of a hidden way. So questions about the IRB. So if we are making our data available, we know that we need to have permission from the community that we work with, but our institutional frameworks have yet to catch up to that concept in a way that allows us to keep our data, not get rid of it after 5 years. So I think that we need to push on in communicating with our human subjects offices to change the systems that they insist on. I think citation practices are another way to both promote data sharing and to recognize the work that goes into producing a profound, comprehensive data set like what the archaeological team produced. That should be recognized. Just the production of a data set like that needs to be recognized as a publication or a production of important intellectual work, which then speaks to the issues of tenure and promotion. As the engineering assistant professor said, I'm not going to share my data because somebody might use it and publish it. But if we require citation of data sets and then also push our institutions to recognize that as intellectual work, then promotion and tenure can also be tied to this variety of kinds of intellectual production, knowledge production. And I'll stop with that and let Deb come up.
Our next discussant is Dr. Deborah Winslow from the National Science Foundation.
Okay, so I have slides, right? So I'll say that I did do slides. I'm not sure I struck the right note here, but we'll see how this goes. Which one?
Just the right one.
Okay.
You can see it down there.
Can I put this here so that I can, it's in presenter mode, right? So I can read off the bottom of the screen? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Oops, I guess it is. I'm not seeing what. So what I see here is not what's on there.
You should see this down here. You don't see it?
Okay, so if I move this, this doesn't change. It does up there, but it doesn't here.
Okay. And just another wonderful thing about today. Or you can see them.
Oh,
here,
okay,
so-
thank you for that. Okay. So here's the disclaimer we tell all grantees have to make, and this is the one I have to make. NSF made it possible for me to come to these meetings, but they are not responsible for anything I say. So now, I'm sorry, I now have the opposite problem, which that's not changing and this is.
Just try clicking it again.
See?
Oh, yeah, that's weird. Here. What's going on? I'm at a loss. So it's not, we're not getting any change on the,
This changes, but the,
there it goes. Okay.
okay. So during the last few decades, we have become aware that we have, in many levels, a data crisis. And as a field, we have faced, and this is the thing that I was most concerned about when I first went to NSF a decade ago, the passing of the largest generation of anthropologists ever and the potential loss of their observations of people, places, and ways of life that no longer exist. And we're not the only ones. I mean, not cultural anthropologists, but also archaeologists and linguists coping with all kinds of different materials from wax cylinders, not to mention photos, films, videos, the lot. And there are many claims on these materials, from native peoples who want them returned to them, to the future generations of scholars who want access to them. And what I have learned is that as a community, we feel a shattering sense of responsibility for this material, and that was before the federal government slipped themselves into these conversations. And I think that our solutions to this problem of data archiving, data sharing, and now how we face up to not only the reality of digitizing data and collecting data digitally, but the effects of that change on our field. These are major conversations for all of us, and I think they affect not just our data, but also us as scientists. But my overall sense is that we can solve these problems and that we will solve them from multiple points of view, and that has been demonstrated ably in the papers today. There are many different perspectives. The three people that I have up here today are Marvin Harris, and when I first went to NSF, somebody told me that many of his materials had been dumpstered because nobody knew what to do with them. A friend of mine in the middle, Gloria Jean Davis, who after teaching at Yale for a while, went to work for the World Bank, and I know that when she died, all of her materials from fieldwork in Sulawesi were destroyed. And then on the left is Hal Conklin, who was one of NSF's first awardees, but through the last few years of his life, spent basically full time figuring out how to archive, digitize, and make available for future generations his materials. So he is sort of the model for the way I hope to see the field go. I'm unable to, we're getting there, but I can't. Okay, now we're back to the earlier one, so let's just leave it at that. This is good enough. So I'm going to give some background. We've heard about how data are defined, and it turns out that the definition that the people at the NIH is using, that NSF is using, comes from a 1999 circular from the Office of Management and Budget. And this defined data as recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. And it excluded trade secrets, materials that had to be kept private, materials that researchers didn't want to publish until, didn't want to make public until they had published, things that would violate people's privacy. And so what the government is saying is that when we put into place a data plan, and we require researchers to put this into place, In fact, we don't mean everything that could be counted as data. We mean only certain things. And the reason it was done in 1999 was the government wanted to be able to use data whose collection they had funded. So if they had government wanted to develop a policy on something and they thought that research had been funded that might help them develop that policy, they had the right to go after that data. And then the second piece was that the public had the right to know about the data on which government policies were being developed. So that was the original impetus for this 1999 circular, and those definitions have carried over into all the subsequent agency requirements. So NSF's own data management plan, which we've heard a little bit about and which I'm sure you and your students are coping with, came out of the Obama administration's larger open government initiatives. And as you know, the DMP began in January 18th, 2011. Again, the goal was that the community would decide what best practices were. The community would decide what the standards were. And I think that it's important to keep coming back to that, because that really means it's up to us to decide what data are, what the standards are for sharing, what the standards are for proof, that there isn't some sort of larger government entity saying you must do this, this, and this. But it also means that we have to examine ourselves, and we have to know who we are as a community. And it turns out that when different people look into that mirror, different pieces of our community, whether archaeologists or biological anthropologists, as we have seen, we see very different things. So people working with Native Americans, as you heard with Sean's work today, or people working very intensively with a small community in a remote area of Malawi where they don't have access and they aren't as aware of how their data can be used, will have other kinds of concerns. And that variety is very typical of anthropology. And I think it's both a strength and it also can become an immobilizing weakness. So now we're back to the earlier problem. So if you could see this slide, what it would say was that what it would say is that I see in these presentations both cause for optimism. I think that Dr. Shortman's presentation, Dr. Shortman, Bell, Nolt, and Urban's presentation, I love the notion of a cathedral science, although we don't want to think about the working conditions of the people who build those cathedrals, but that we are in a cumulative enterprise. And in talking to anthropologists and in dealing with students writing data management plans, the notion that they are contributing to a larger scientific enterprise turns out to be less common in anthropology and social sciences in general than it does in biological and other kinds of sciences. And I think that's an important thing to teach students, that they are part of this larger flow of knowledge. We have also heard from Shortman, Bell, Knowlton, Urban, the benefits of digitization in the context of the classroom, in the context of pedagogy, and that it makes everything, or a lot of their data, as it is digitized, as that presents a certain reality of what they were doing, accessible to other people and accessible to reanalysis. Similar, Verheyen talked about the situation in Malawi, her research in Malawi, and the research awards for both the researched people and for the researcher and for future generations of people who, future scholars who might want to reanalyze the materials. She talked about some of the risks of that material and strategies for overcoming them. I found both of these presentations really impressive and really optimistic and wonderful models for how we might do this. Now we'll see what, if I press forward, what we get, because we're getting different things. Okay, we got that. And so now we're back to where I can see this and it's not on here. So we also found challenges, that there are vast differences in research cultures from different kinds of scientists, and that they require resources that we don't always have. And then there's the issue of multiple interests, multiple stakeholders that we found with Sean Bruno's project. The opportunities, I like the phrase he used, and I've heard other people use it, particularly linguists, the decolonization of our work by increasing access, by not having this sort of proprietary sense of knowledge, and we'll just tell you what it all adds up to. And he mentioned NAGPRA, and for NAGPRA we know that that has been important because people don't actually always want the original artifacts back. Sometimes they're contaminated with arsenic and other things. So sometimes really good images, digitized images, satisfy the requirement and actually work better for people's concern. So digitization has this accessibility context to it, which is really wonderful, but can also present challenges. In the future, I think that we need to think about the unintended consequences, and I am beginning to see in the data management plans and in research articles that once you start thinking of what you are collecting, not just as a narrative you're telling about other people's lifeways, but as specific pieces of information, it can change who you think you're studying, what you think you're doing, and what you think your task is as a science. And I don't think that's a problem necessarily, but I think it produces a kind of consciousness that we can see even in these presentations and that we should be aware of. And then I'm going to end by talking about a few things that the cultural anthropology program at NSF has been involved in. In 2012, Lisa and Una Schmidt at the AAA put on a workshop on archiving anthropology, and this produced the Data Registry Wiki for the AAA, in which people who are maintaining archives of materials can register their archives so other people know that it exists. In 2015 and this year, the end of last year and the beginning of this year, the AAA did a series of workshops that produced teaching materials. And if you go on the AAA website, you'll find these teaching materials. They were referred to earlier today, but there's a module for linguistics, one for biological anthropology, one for archaeology, and one for cultural anthropology that talk about bringing digital data management into the methods courses for anthropology. And one of the interesting things about those teaching modules as you go through them is this constant theme of ethics and a sort of fear that somehow as it becomes more sort of preserved and frozen as digital materials, that it will be misused or that it's open to misinterpretation, and that this raises a whole other issue. I was very impressed reading through them how much, even though it's a sort of technical discussion, how much ethics wove through all of those materials. And finally, this year, we have just funded a postdoc at the National Anthropological Archives, which is at the Smithsonian, and their finding aids are tremendously out of date. That is to say, if you want to find a certain kind of material, a certain kind of record that they might have, or a certain kind of object that they might have, the card cataloging was done in the 19th century, and you may or may not get the categories you need. So they are one of the, for us, one of the most important collections, and we hope that it will be expanded in the future so that it can accept more anthropological materials. But this postdoc that we're funded for 3 years there will be sort of updating the way in which these are things in categories, even as he is assessing the collections. So those are the only remarks I have, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, everyone, for putting up with our mishaps here. We have this high-tech room and nobody to show us how to use it well. We are over time, but nobody seems to be kicking us out. So if anybody has a question for any of our panelists, we could answer them. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I do want to thank everyone that participated. This has been not a challenge, but a pleasure to put together. And I think as we read each other's abstracts and started thinking about this, we saw how the synergies and the thinking go. And it's exciting because there are so many people who need this kind of information. We all can benefit from this work that's going on. And we encourage everybody who's here and who sees this to get in contact, to look at the resources that we've put up, that everyone here has produced, and think about moving forward. And because, like I said, it's a cathedral. We all benefit from each other's work. And let's talk. And we're just really excited to be here. And we appreciate the AAA putting us in this room. And I just appreciate all, except for the computer part. But this will all be available. So anyway, thank each of you. Thank you for being here. So anyway, thanks guys.